And Matt RHULE, of course, has gone to his first fall camp in Lincoln here. And your thoughts about what Nebraska needs to get done here in the next 3 to 4 weeks to have any shot of getting back to postseason play?
Yeah, they're about a week in right now. I think, some of the things that have hounded Nebraska over the last 6 years, during which time they haven't made a bowl game, would be the lines of scrimmage on both sides, offensive line, defensive line. I think they both struggled, and both are sort of question marks coming into this year, but for different reasons. Like the offensive line is a pretty veteran unit. It has most of its starters back from last year, but it has been sort of an underachieving group. And so I'm kind of curious to see what this new staff in an off season under some of these new support personnel might do for that offensive line. And then on the other side, they essentially have one guy in the trenches who has any experience in the Big Ten by the name of Ty Robinson, and everybody else is a transfer or a freshman or an unknown, essentially. So what do those lines look like as they sort of get into the season at Minnesota here at the end of the month? That's where I start. I think that's where a lot of the competition is. I will say some of the things that have occurred in camp so far, I think, have been more kind of big picture culture things. For example, Matt RHULE has decided to split, at least for the first part of fall camp, split the workouts into a 60-man group of more of the veterans, and then they run through the other 60 separately with the same coaches, all in the name of development. And so I don't know how much that'll pay off here in the first month or two, but I do think long term, that's the sort of thing that Nebraska has to have. And they've had a couple of defections here in fall camp. Their tight ends coach was cited for a DUI last week. He resigned. And then a starting safety from the last year and a half by the name of Miles Farmer entered the transfer portal. And mostly it was because of not wanting to, accommodate to these new standards that this staff has. So I think they're really setting a tone culturally. And then a lot of the football stuff is still starting to shake itself out here with a few weeks until the first game.
I thought that Matt RHULE was the most thoughtful and the most entertaining, that combination at Big Ten Media Days, both at the podium, but mostly on the side session. And to your point, he talked about we're going to have the most disciplined team that we possibly can have. And it's going to start with being on time, being responsible, taking care of everything that seems to be not football related. And that there's a culture, the shift that's pretty significant. I specifically asked him, he walked in a locker room at Temple that was similar from the standpoint of nobody in the room ever won anything at that level. He walked in at the locker room for the first time at Baylor. Nobody knew how to win there and nobody had won. And now he's facing the same thing with much higher stakes at Nebraska. And how do you turn that type situation and mindset around? And he started talking about very granular details. So he's a detail-oriented coach following a coach who wasn't considered to be very detail-oriented at all.
Right. I mean, and that's true. And he would be the first to tell you that his situations at Temple and Baylor were a lot more dire than what he has at Nebraska, right? I mean, Temple was kind of on its deathbed as a football program. Baylor was coming out of the scandals from the Art Briles era. And Nebraska has just been, I guess, by comparison, chronic underachievers, right? Like they have the fan support. They've still sold out every home game since the early 1960s. The support structure around the football program has always been really strong. They have a sports science facility within the stadium that they utilize. Their NIL package is competitive, if not even more than that. It's just been a lot of the on-field stuff and a lot of the small stuff. And when you're in a conference that is investing in football to the extent that the Big Ten is, sometimes, and I think most times, it comes down to that little stuff, right? I mean, are you on time? Are you in the right position, right? Like I think half a dozen players have already changed positions under Matt RHULE, and we'll see how that shakes out. I think he puts a lot of emphasis on explaining to the players why they're doing this, why they're doing that, what goes into the process. And it's not just listen to what I say because I'm the smartest guy here, but it's there's a strategic thought behind pretty much everything that Matt Rhule does or Matt Rhule says. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's refreshing. It's much different as compared to his predecessor, Scott Frost, who, at the time, 5 years ago, everybody thought that he was the answer. And I think, too, you talking about Big Ten Media Days, it reminded me back in 2018 when Scott Frost made his Big Ten Media Days debut, and his first year was full of bold proclamations. I think the most famous was, you better get us now because you won't be able to get us later, essentially. And Matt Rhule took a much different tone. I don't think he made really any bold proclamations about what Nebraska would be. It was just a steady kind of series of, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it, this is why we do what we do. And the results, tend to come, or at least they have in his career. So I think that's a much different approach that he's taking in that regard too.
I thought Casey Thompson did a capable job last year, and obviously the offense fell completely off the cliff when he was injured. He did lead the Big 12 in touchdown passes the previous season. And when they signed Jeff Sims, I thought, okay, this makes for an interesting quarterback battle. And it didn't turn out to be much of a battle. Jeff Sims must have shown something, because for Casey Thompson to leave programs like Texas and Nebraska to go to FAU, and we did have a guest, Zach Smith, who told us just a couple days after Jeff Sims was signed that based on his coaching contacts that they said Jeff Sims is going to win this job. And so I was slightly surprised, not shocked. And now Jeff Sims wants to prove himself to be a capable thrower and not just an athlete.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think the thing that also affected that quarterback race in the spring was Casey Thompson was recovering from a shoulder procedure. And so he sat out pretty much the entire spring. And that's really hard when you have a new staff and you have a new quarterback who was handpicked by that staff in the building, and you as the incumbent starter were not able to compete. And so to his credit, he was a film rat, a football junkie. I mean, he lived in the stadium doing his thing. I think he did impress the coaches and make it a little bit more interesting than maybe that they thought it would. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think he understood that playing time for a guy who's going into his final year, being Casey Thompson, was going to happen somewhere else. He didn't want to go up against kind of that handpicked guy that the new staff brought in. And so, yeah, it's been Sims pretty clearly for the last 3 or 4 months now since he's been here. The staff really challenged him and said, look, the two things we need you to do in the offseason are to improve your completion percentage and to cut down on the turnovers. And you look at his career at Georgia Tech, he's completing, 58% of his passes during his career. I think he's accounted for 41 touchdowns and 31 turnovers, whether that's interceptions or fumbles lost. And so you can kind of see a pretty wide range of outcomes with what Jeff Sims can do. I mean, he can create with his big arm and his quick legs, but he can also hurt you on occasion with some of those giveaways as well. So I think it's interesting because the view or the outlook on Nebraska this year is so wide. I mean, you just look at some of the preseason voting. I mean, they could contend in the West. They could finish 5th or 6th again if things go poorly. And I think Jeff Sims is sort of the embodiment of that, where he can give you a lot. And if things don't improve from what he's done earlier in his career, maybe that can hold you back a little bit too. So really fascinated to see what his development's like, under Nebraska, under Matt Rhule.
To his defense, most of the time that he stepped on the field at Georgia Tech, at least within conference play, he was stepping onto the field with an inferior team taking on better teams.
Sure.
Typically, they were a pretty substantial underdog in those games, and he had to somewhat carry the team on offense. We got Evan Bland here from the Omaha World Herald talking Huskers football. Evan, if this team is to be successful, what are the strengths? You talked about the line of scrimmage not being anywhere close to Nebraska standards on either side, especially the offensive side. What are the strengths of this team that they could really play to this year?
Well, I think honestly, their special teams should be pretty good. They have a freshman kicker who's coming in who I think has the inside track to be the starter, named Tristan Alvano. Their punter, Brian Buschini, is one of the best in the Big Ten. He was last year. as a transfer from the FCS level. And then I think, their back seven defensively should be a strength. They've got two really veteran linebackers in the middle in Luke Reimer and Nick Henrich. They added a couple of toolsy transfers on the outside in Chief Borders and MJ Sherman. And then their secondary, despite the loss of Miles Farmer, who'd been a starting safety, is still really deep. Both of their corners are back. Quentin Newsome has been a staple for that unit for 3 years now. And so he's got some experience. So I think you start in the back seven defensively. And then, on offense, there are just a lot of really intriguing pieces. I mean, the running back room is deep. I think Gabe Ervin is a guy who's in his third year who was maybe one of the biggest spring risers under this new staff. They like his attitude. They like his speed, his dependability. But that's a pretty deep room, too, when you add in Anthony Grant, who carried more than 200 times for Nebraska last year. Ramir Johnson, who was really good in 21 before sort of finding the bench last year as well. And then I think tight end, too. I mean, you have Thomas Fidone, who was the number 1 or 2 national recruit at his position out of high school, who's been hurt. He's had consecutive knee injuries. He's fully healthy. Eric Gilbert, the Georgia transfer, we're still waiting to see whether he gets a waiver as a 2-time transfer to play right away. But he's a guy, former 5-star recruit, who could help them immediately. So that they have some pieces. And I do think that their style of offense, going to more of a pro-style attack, is going to be beneficial to them and to just their style in the Big Ten, as opposed to sort of that quick tempo spread offense that so often had them behind over the last few years. It feels like there's a vision now to maybe control the clock a little bit better, protect that defense, and shorten some games, at least early on, to stay competitive this season.
Matt RHULE did say that the power run will be important and it will be prominent. That doesn't mean that they're going to line up in an I formation and try to, pound people up the middle that way. They may spread them out. They'll do whatever they need to do, but the run inside the tackles has to be a foundation of this offense going forward. Evan Bland, Omaha World Herald, breaking down the Huskers for us. Evan, we appreciate you stopping by. We're just a few weeks away, of course, from the opener in Minneapolis.
Can't wait. Thanks for having me. Let's get some football.